one in the back raised their hand, but I know that you've been here before. So after the program, please walk around, browse. They have an amazing poetry section, and I see they have a blind date with a book there. I'm going to be checking those out. So Borderless Conversations on Art, Action, and Justice is about the power of words and the role of art in reflecting and changing our world. In this interview series, you hear from emerging and established writers about how and why they write and why it matters. This is a series about breaking down borders between people, between forms of expression, between identities and nations, between art and action, and tonight between scholars who study the world and the rest of us who just want it to be better. So my guest is Raj Patel, an award-winning writer, activist, and academic. He is a research professor in the Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas, Austin, and a senior research associate at the Unit for the Humanities at the university, currently known as Rhodes University in South Africa. In addition to the numerous scholarly publications in economics, philosophy, politics, and public health journals, he regularly writes for The Guardian and has contributed to the Financial Times, Los Angeles Times, New York Times, Times of India, the San Francisco Chronicle, the Mail on Sunday, and The Observer. His first book was Stuffed and Starved, The Hidden Battle for the World Food System. His second, The Value of Nothing, was a New York Times and international bestseller. And his latest, co-written with Jason W. Moore, is A History of the World in 7 Cheap Things, the work that we will mostly be discussing tonight, which you can purchase back there. So please join me in welcoming Raj Patel. So you wanted to talk about chicken nuggets, right?
I do want to talk about chicken nuggets. So and thank you so much for inviting me here. Thank you, Malvern Books, for just being awesome. And thank you for coming. You very kindly invited me to read from the book, and I didn't want to suffer anyone my monotone. In the beginning, there was capitalism, and it was bad. And so rather than that, what I'd like to do is just very quickly talk about one of the sort of central themes in the book. Because Jason and I were, in this book, we were concerned to see if we can come to a way of understanding capitalism that people can share. And so we hunted for the most capitalist thing. And the most capitalist thing, it turns out, is chicken nuggets. And the reason is that while for most OECD countries, the consumption of meat is going down if it has 4 legs. Basically, if it's 4-legged, the French, the British, the Germans, everyone except Americans, basically, in the global north, is eating less of it. But chickens are buggered. Everyone's eating more chicken. And it's really important to understand why it is that if there is any civilization after humans, what they will find is trillions of chicken bones in the fossil record, right? Because we go through, there are 12 billion chickens alive at the moment, but not for long, because it's 90 days from egg to nugget. But that process, so every year we go through 50 billion and the number's going up. So that every human is eating about 30 pounds of chicken a year. Every human alive. So that's trillions of chicken bones that's written into the fossil record. Why? Why is it that a sign of the fact that humanity existed on the planet, written into the fossil record, is the chicken nugget? So we explore this using the 7 things that we talk about in the book. First of all, cheap nature. To take the red jungle fowl from the jungles of East and Southeast Asia and turn it into the modern broiler, which is so mutated that it has breasts so large it can't walk. It requires a sort of license to understand nature as the sort of thing that we can do whatever we want to with. We can use nature as an infinite resource and an infinite trash bin. And that is, that is coming undone with the 6th extinction at the moment. So cheap nature is important. But chickens don't turn themselves into nuggets by magic. You need work. And so the second thing we talk about is cheap work. And workers are desperately underpaid in the food system in general. If you spend $1 on nuggets, and I hope you don't, but if you spend $1 on nuggets, about 1 cent or 2 goes to workers. But elaborate schemes have been hatched to reduce the labor costs. Workers are used prison laborers are used in the manufacture of chicken, and in Oklahoma, genius-level chicken executives came up with this fantastic solution of killing 2 birds with 1 stone. It's really hard to get workers to work on the chicken slaughter line at night, because it's awful work at any time, but at night you also would prefer to sleep. What they did in Oklahoma was create something called Christian Alcoholics and Addicts in Recovery. And this was an institution created by chicken executives, where what they were doing was saying, look, people are suffering the effects of the opioid crisis. That's awful. Let's not send them to prison. Let's send them to us. And they can pray to the Almighty and let Jesus Christ, their Savior, save their souls during the day. And at night, as part of their therapy, they will work 8 hours on the chicken line for free. So labor costs are 0. And what I find interesting about that is that it's a return to the original form of labor that was used when the Spanish colonized this continent. What is it that happened? But the Spanish came and enslaved indigenous people and said, you must work and you get to praise to the Lord Jesus Christ Almighty, and you'll be saved. So work is an important part of this. The third thing is care, because people's bodies are broken systematically by the chicken production. Everything from a repetitive strain injury to psychological trauma. Who is it that looks after the broken bodies? It's usually the community, and by the community that's a euphemism for usually gendered reproductive labor. It's women's work in general to look after the bodies of broken workers. The fourth thing that we talk about is cheap food. I mean, the irony here is that cheap chicken is, cheap food in general, is what it is that keeps wages low. If you're being paid poverty wages or nothing at all, then actually cheap, ultra-processed food is vital if you're to be able to put dinner on the table. So that's the fourth thing. The fifth thing is cheap energy. In order for to heat the hen houses, to run the machinery that makes these nuggets, you need cheap fossil fuels, and of course that's contributing to climate change. The sixth thing you need is cheap money. Every independent franchise, every independent KFC is a small business, and they're eligible for low interest loans that you and I can't get. But cheap money means low interest loans. And why is it that our president is hammering on at the Fed to reduce the price of money? Because he wants money to be cheap for the ruling class. And all of that drives pressures to the idea of cheap lives. And that's the seventh cheap thing. We talk about how it is that if you look at who's on the chicken production line, disproportionately it's women and people of color. It is the bodies of communities who have always been outside the sort of privileged circuits of capitalism, and who are, ultimately sort of represented in the rise of international modern-day slavery. And there are 50 million people in modern-day slavery today, 50 million in forced labor, and the rest in forced marriage. And all of this is a way of saying the chicken nugget depends on all of these 7 cheap things in order to be the thing that appears on your plate. So rather than me reading that out, I thought I'd just...
That's fantastic, because I was like, I wonder how we're going to kind of give a picture of what all these cheap things are and how they are interconnected. And so you've done that very well. Thank you. So I have an idea of why I think, and I'm happy to share, why I think this book is important for people to read. But I was wondering if you had a particular reader in mind, and what are you trying to do with this book?
We're trying to sit at a point about what we're trying to do is say that if you're really concerned about labor, you should also be concerned about patriarchy. And if you're really concerned about patriarchy, you really should be concerned about climate change and racism and the food crisis. Because in the real world, everything is intersectional, and you can't separate one thing from the other. And what we want to do is make an intervention by reporting in a sense from the grassroots up to say, look at all the struggles we care about today. They're always intersectional. They always have been intersectional. And although different movements have sort of run in different directions, so you've got the environmental movement here and the labor movement there, the real sort of the lived experience of these struggles has always been right in the middle of people fighting to be able to look after their families and to make sure that the house was heated and there was enough food on the table and that people were treated with dignity. And all of that is to say everything is intersectional. Does that concur with what? I mean, I think that was important. But
so yeah, I mean, I think it does actually really show how all of these different things intersect. Capitalism is intersectional, so so it makes sense. And I have more thoughts when you put it that way. What I was thinking was, there's a lot of people I know who are concerned about capitalism think of it as like a conspiracy of people. The CEOs or the 1% or the ruling, sometimes it's even like these really crazy conspiracy theories. But I thought what this book did was show how these things developed. And it's not necessarily that it was like, this is planned. And I like that you went all the way back to the roots of capitalism and showed how it made sense to have these, starting with cheap nature and how these things developed, and then to this point where it's just sort of the gears are churning, right? So like the point about cheap food, for instance, that I thought was so interesting was that actually allowed them, it's sort of like a subsidy for the capitalists, right? Because the workers can get cheap food, that's stuff they don't have to, they can take that off the wages. And it sort of holds revolution at bay. I mean, so there were all these, I just thought that the way it illustrated how these things weave together, but how they developed. And it's not some, seven men in a room, right? I thought that was important. And yeah, so I think it was very readable. I mean, I felt like I got a very good grounding in how the system works in a book where I do have capital. I already have capital on my bookshelf, but I have not cracked it open yet. So I just thought maybe we could talk about like one thing that I think people. So this thing of capitalism continually expanding, having to expand. Can you talk a little bit about why frontiers are so important to capitalism? And that's, in the first part, nature, that's sort of the driving thing, right? They're going out into nature, conquering one part after another. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, so we have a useful villain when it comes to capitalism. His name is Christopher Columbus. And we use Columbus as this sort of figure, as someone who sort of is there in the important founding moments of capitalism. Because if you want to understand capitalism, Christopher Columbus is your guide. His diaries are a kind of how-to for any budding frontier-based capitalist. And for us, what we were excited about was how going through Columbus's diaries, it also looks strikingly like Elon Musk's Twitter feed. What Columbus was about was trying to turn the promise of some future amazing thing into the sort of thing that bankers would give him a crap ton of money for. And important in that is the idea that we will go to this place and we will exploit the shit out of it, and we will bring back profit. And we will do it all along the way by exploiting workers. Christopher Columbus famously underpaid his sailors. He had this competition, but whoever sees land first gets gold doubloons. And so some bloke said, in the middle of the night while Columbus was saying, "Oh, I found it, and there it is!" And then, of course, Columbus wakes up the next morning and says, "Oh, I think I saw it first." And he gets the annuity a tax that was made, in Seville on, I think, on the sale of bacon, provided for Columbus's annuity for the rest of his life. And so, he steals. He's involved in the transatlantic slave trade. In his diaries, he says that he's bringing over indigenous people to Europe. We always think the transatlantic slave trade is slaves from Europe going to the New World, but he starts it by bringing New World indigenous people to Europe. And he says, in the name of the Holy Trinity, let us bring as many slaves over as can be brought. And in every way, cheap lives, cheap money, cheap nature. And he looks at nature, and he writes in his diary that he's sad that he doesn't know how much it's worth. That's his first response to seeing the New World. It's like, there are so many plants and animals here, and I'm depressed by not knowing their worth. He writes back. So that's super interesting, because that's sort of Elon. Elon Musk has, he's had cases before the National Labor Relations Board, right? We already know that he is an exploiter of workers. We know that he's involved. The components in his cars are made cheap through the kind of slavery we see in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. The labor is cheap because it rests on free or cheap reproductive labor. He is exploiting nature, and of course, I think the most important thing is he's always looking for the new frontier. And capitalism does always need new frontiers, whether it's about your genes being turned into commodities. So whenever you give your genetic information to 23andMe or whatever it is, they're cashing in. Whenever plant genetic material is being turned into a new proprietary seed, Monsanto or now Bayer is making money. Whenever Elon Musk says we are going to colonize Mars, he's opening up a new frontier. Even when just as we published the book, the Financial Times had a special supplement on space mining, because capitalism always needs new frontiers, whether it's genetic material or whether it's our attention in the attention economy, or whether it's our genetic material, or whether it is space. There's always a new frontier. They always have to find and create new spaces in which you can extract resources to fix the problems that you've created from the extraction of the resources that the wasteland that you've created through the advance of capitalism. So whether it's deep sea mining or space mining or going to colonize Mars, capitalism needs new frontiers from which to extract resources to fix the problems it's created or patch up the problems that it's created in its hinterland. So does that make sense?
But it can't really do that, right? Because there's 72 million refugees in the world right now. There's talk about the future of work where robotics is going to take over and eliminate. So I guess what I'm asking is, it's expanding and expanding, but at some point it can't expand anymore. But people think that the system's going to go on forever. But in the meantime, humanity's like in a crisis situation, and so I'm wondering is capitalism going to take humanity and the planet down with it, or is
What do you think?
So this is something this is something obviously I'm thinking about a lot. I'm very I'm thinking about it almost constantly. I think a lot of people are. I have a question about climate change here. And incidentally, my third question was how important was Columbus to the development of capitalism? But I think, I actually think that this is not sustainable. So I'm looking into what is going to come after capitalism and what's next. Here's what I think. I don't think that this system can be reformed. I don't think there's a solution for climate change under this capitalist system. Because one thing I get from your book and other things I've read is that it is really a compulsion. I was writing an essay a few years ago, and I had this sort of thesis that maybe all the apocalyptic literature was just getting people ready for genocide, like climate genocide and stuff. And I was talking to somebody who's a political economist, and she said, these people, these CEOs of these companies, don't they care? Don't they have grandchildren that they care about? And she said, they don't have any control over it. This is a this is the here, you know, the CEO of some, I mean, I think the CEO of Monsanto is pretty evil, but, you know, the CEOs of these companies themselves might be very concerned, but they have to follow the rules of the system, right? So that's where I am. What do you?
I mean, I agree with you. I think you're right. That it's possible to create a system where no single individual needs to be a sort of Blofeldian villain stroking a cat, sort of cackling at the demise of humanity. You don't need that. All you need is a set of rules that says, look, we'll only pay you if you extract profit. And what's the way to extract profit but to externalize the costs of environmental destruction, not really care about the fact that you're rendering species extinct or belching out greenhouse gases that will eventually kill everyone. And you've got the sort of setup, and certainly not care that reproductive labor is unpaid, and not care about the sort of axes of food, and depend on the state for the protection of cheap money and protection of property. It's very easy to see how everyone just following the rules as they have been written is going to lead us into a very, very parlous situation. And I hang out with the climate change folk quite a lot, and they're very, very depressed. And I think that they're right to be. I mean, you look at what it is that we participate in as rebels under capitalism, that we are nonetheless under capitalism, and we find ourselves heading towards some very, very dark times. And then, of course, what I hear and what one can see is a bifurcation between the people who can afford to buy themselves out of the situation and those who cannot. And that seems to be the sort of the major sort of division of the 21st century is: can you afford to write this out, or can you not?
Well, how do you resolve that tension? I think a lot of times when you talk to someone and you say, well, the root of this problem is capitalism, they sort of think this is like an excuse for you to not recycle or something. Like you should, you're giving yourself a pass. I had a big argument with somebody on Facebook over this, but so
what do they say? I'm on Facebook.
Well, I think it was that this person thought that if they acknowledged that there was a system that was driving this climate change, that meant that they couldn't. It didn't matter if they stopped eating meat or if they, their individual choices. Like everything was about individual choices. Actually, it was in response to this quote that kept going out from Jane Goodall that. If billions of people made the right choice, we could solve this crisis. And then I just reacted to it. I was like, first of all, billions of people, not that people have no agency, but billions of people are not the ones who are creating this crisis. I mean, if you consider like the billions of people living in utter poverty, they're not the ones who are. So I just felt like billions of people, making the right choice. I just felt like it was so. Anyway, so I guess I reacted sort of angrily, and somebody wrote back and said, "You're totally wrong. Capitalism is not the problem." And then somebody else jumped in and said, "Well, it just sounds like neither of you want to do anything about this problem." So how do you resolve? I mean, for myself, I'm in a research mode. So I read this book, I'm reading several books, I'm looking into how does big societal change happen? How do revolutions happen? I'm reading some more, about the experience of the Soviet Union and China, and what could come next. There's all these theories, right? A lot of people think that capitalism is coming to an end. So. But then we're individuals within the system, right? So, is it a tension for you, or is it?
No, of course. I mean, and I think we have lots of examples of what happens when capitalism ends, and India's an interesting example, right? I mean, that's a, you know, I believe the technical term is still fascism for what's going on there, and it's that's what happens when capitalism entered a crisis in Europe in the 1930s. And it's interesting that while Europe went fascist, America had the Green New Deal. Sorry, not Green New, just regular New Deal, right? Telegraphing my intentions. But I mean, I think that there are ways to confront this, but they all involve social change and organizing and a rejection. I think. I mean, you know, basically, if you hear the word choice, your hackles ought to be raised. Choice is a desperately poisonous word because it is precisely about the idea of an individual being more powerful in their consumption habits than anyone can reasonably think. Because here's the example that comes to mind. You heard of the yellow vest protests in France. What's that about? Well, in part, what it's about is folk who've been gentrified out of town and can't anymore afford to live in the middle of the city that they once grew up in. And they've been, you know, they live in the suburbs or they live in, you know, the French equivalent of Buda. And then the French government says, you have to pay a tax because you're driving into town every day. It has a big carbon footprint, and that's all your fault. And you need to choose differently. And one of the ways we're going to help you choose is by giving you a tax on petrol, on gasoline. And of course, people are like, well, fuck that, kids. Sorry, yeah, mum. I mean, there's something desperately wrong with the idea that you can gentrify someone out of town and then blame them for their carbon footprint. Yes, I know I should have said that. But then, I mean, that I think is really an important part of the idea of choice, right? I mean, if you are on minimum wage and you are expected to choose wisely in your dietary habits, as the USDA encourages you to do, there's no way that you can choose wisely and still live within your means. You know, and this is a global phenomenon. Half of the people in low-income countries cannot afford to eat 5 fresh fruits and vegetables a day. So there's no point wagging your finger saying, well, you know, if only you weren't drinking so much Coke or you know, eating so many ultra-processed foods, everything would be fine. People can't afford to do the right thing. And so you blame the victim when you talk about, when you bring in this logic of choice and the sort of political ecology of choice that comes with that. And so that's why I think that the discussions around choice are dangerous, and that's why I don't like James Goodall's line there, other than choose revolution, which I encourage people to do. But I don't think that, I mean, look, if we all went vegan tomorrow, which I'm down with, I think that's a great idea, but that's not going to solve capitalism. All it's going to mean is that our carbon footprint might be a little less, and importantly less, and also animals would suffer less, and that's important. But is that going to stop workers being exploited? Is that going to stop patriarchy? Is it going to stop the extraction of fossil fuels? No, it's not. It's just going to mean that we make a choice to reduce our consumption of certain kinds of things. But it's not going to alter some of the structures of power that are in place that are designed to exploit the environment and to in fact, separate us from the world on which we depend.
Right. So I mean, I think I wish more artists would sort of understand this, but I'm not sure why. I'm trying to think this out, but you know, there's this, I think it comes from Marx, the base and the superstructure, right? So there's the underlying base of the production relation, the means of production, the relations of production, then everything else like culture, government, everything else is above that. It's not that can't influence things, but that underlying base is the decisive force, right? And you make this point in the book where you talk about solar panels, like really briefly, but so the materials that go into the solar panels are also like extracted through horrible, you know, exploitative means where they have to mine these materials. So you're not changing those underlying conditions, right?
Yeah. Can I just make a point there about this sort of base superstructure thing?
Yeah.
Because
there's a sort of school of Marxism that says, look, if only workers owned the means of production, everything would be great. And that's not how it goes, right? I mean, I think that what Marx is saying is that you have these ideas of culture and of nationalism, for example, that are actually really important, that can shape the way that people think about their relationships to power. And so he's not saying that nationalism is, just sort of emerges from the relations of production. What he's saying is that there's a dialectical relation. In fact, nationalism can be really important in shaping the way that people think about their relations to power. And again, I don't want to harp on about meat, but I've just been thinking a lot about meat recently. It's been really interesting to see how it is that vegans, for example, are trying to create cultural spaces to be able to be vegans and to encourage us all to move away from meat consumption. Because to eat meat is profoundly American. And to be anything other than a consumer of meat is to be anti-American. And everywhere I look in circles of vegans around the world, except in India, and that's a different story, where Indians are very happy to attack Muslims for eating beef. In the United States, not eating beef is an anti-American act, which I'm very happy to do. I mean, I think that it's important not to be nationalist. And I think that it's the idea, the power of nationalism to shape what it is to be normal is really, we can't underestimate it. And so, merely organizing so that everyone owns the means of production is not enough. That there has to be this sort of cultural war position.
Right. There's a line that stood out for me. I didn't write it down, but this quote that capitalism can't always be reduced to economics or something like that. Can you explain a little bit what that means? I mean, I think it's complete. It's what we're just talking about. It's completely true, and a lot of people do think that it's just all about the economic relations. But in the cheap care chapter, you're really talking about the patriarchy that emerged and how that actually came out of the system and then serves the system going forward too. But can you talk a little bit about that line?
Just very briefly, supply and demand, where does that come from? The idea that we could just, that these things appear naturally in economics classes. Here is supply, here is demand. These are very natural things. There's nothing natural about supply and demand. It takes work to have a supply of labor. It takes work to have demand for people to sell their time so that they can have enough money to be able to put food on the table. These are not natural phenomena. And what we talk about is the history of capitalism is not just the history of workers fighting for their rights. Often when you think about capitalism, we're often told about externalities. Does everyone understand what externalities are? Okay, so an externality is, capitalism, for example, doesn't pay for the social costs of exploiting people. It doesn't pay for, the easy example is burgers. If you included all the costs for environmental destruction that come from leveling the Brazilian rainforest so you can grow soy to feed your cattle, and if you were to include the real cost of the diseases that come from eating as much red meat as we do, the higher rates of colon cancer, the social cost of taking care of people with colon cancer and treating that, and the damage that causes to families, then a dollar burger should cost nearer $200. But it doesn't, it only costs $1. So the $199 is externalities, it's things that are not included in the price. So what we're saying in this book is the history of capitalism isn't just that capitalists got away with it, but always the externalities have struck back. There's always been organizing. It's never been a kind of people just sitting there and taking it. The history of capitalism is about how it is that workers demanded rights, that we've had a powerful movement. We continue to. We have movements of indigenous people who are saying no more and who are getting killed. In fact, the biggest killers of indigenous people and indigenous land defenders now are the food industry around the world. And yet, these are the struggles in order to prevent these externalities being possible. So that's what we're saying, is that the history of capitalism is the history of externalities fighting back. And that's both a dire story, but it's also a hopeful one, right? If externalities can strike back, if
what it is that capitalism doesn't include in supply and demand can fight back. That's a sort of model for hope that I think we often forget.
I want to give time for people in the audience to ask questions, but I have a couple more questions for you. There's one line towards the end of the book that great historical transitions occur because business as usual no longer works. So do you believe that we are in such a moment now?
Definitely. I mean, look, we're already seeing. I mean, what's really interesting. I do a lot of work on hunger, and the hunger numbers are really disturbing. For the past, we're on a trend now. For the past 3 years, more and more humans are malnourished, and the criteria for malnutrition has been severely relaxed. So that to be counted as malnourished is to have not enough calories, not just for one day or for a week, but for a whole year. That's the criteria to be malnourished. That every day for a year, you don't have enough calories in order to be able to survive. And that, the number of humans who fall into that category has been going up for the past 3 years. And that's a reversal of decades of what appeared to be progress. But in fact, it was just us mining the soil on which we depended. And now, because of climate change, crisis, and capitalism, really conflict and capitalism, we're seeing that turning around. Business as usual doesn't seem to be possible, and so you see the market sort of flipping in lots of different ways. Beyond Meat and Impossible Burgers are doing their thing, and there's a fossil fuel company that wants to be a zero carbon fossil fuel company. Bless it. But in general, you still see the exploitation of workers. You still see the widespread abuse of human rights. You see the intensification of these processes. And again, India is sort of exhibit A here of a country where has the greatest concentration of hungry people on earth, and also the intensification of a certain kind of exploitation and we already know that India has lost 17% of its potential wealth because of climate change over the past 50 years or something. There was a Stanford survey that just came out. It's a shocking mess, and I don't see business as usual as possible, which is why we're in this sort of era of choose fascism or choose something that looks like socialism.
So we'll open up to questions. Can you tell us what you're working on?
I'm working on a documentary project that I'm really excited about. We're finishing it up. So it's under the aegis of the guy who did Hoop Dreams. His name's Steve James, and we've been following for the past 8 to 10 years, really, from start to finish, a community in Malawi that's been fighting climate change, patriarchy, and food insecurity at the same time. And they wanted to understand why Americans weren't taking climate change seriously. So they came here. We talked to climate change skeptics and farmers, and it's a story of how change in America was made possible by these women from Malawi. And so that will be out next year. And what I'm excited about is that we're taking those stories and we're working with movements in the United States, so particularly movements in Detroit, to make the articulation about how it is that the story about Malawi matters to folk in the United States, and we're using that as a model for organising with church groups, with food movements, with unions, and so on. And then I'm working with Rupa Maria, who you may have heard of through her band Rupa and the April Fishes. She's also doing some really important work she's a medical doctor at UCSF, and we're doing some work on decolonising food and medicine. So that'll be out.
Where will we be able to see the documentary?
Hopefully South by, if we can get it. So just in a few short months, we ought to be, fingers crossed, we'll be screening.
Congratulations. Do we have questions from the audience? Hope so. Your brain should be churning.
Did you have any other, instead of just meat, did you think of any other possible things like plastic or something extra, like convenience as being inherently capitalist?
Thank you. Plastic, I mean, I think plastic is the other sort of the go-to thing. I love the idea of convenience. We didn't talk about it in this book because I talked about it in Stuffed and Starved, where the example I used there was something called bunny chow. So this is a South African food. Has anyone had bunny chow? Bunny chow? Okay, so this is fantastic. So the story of bunny chow is a story of capitalism and convenience and racism and a range of things. But the idea here is there was a white golf course that had black caddies, and with the introduction of apartheid, the black caddies couldn't eat at the same in the same kitchen as they used to eat, and so now they needed to be able to eat quickly, and so there was a small industry set up outside by some enterprising young folk who realized that what they could do was create this convenience food, and the food is called bunny chow. Now, bunny chow is you take a loaf of white bread, you turn it on its side, you slice the top off, you scoop the inside out, so you've got this hollow bread thing, and then you fill it full of goat curry, and it's delicious. We'll have it one day, except without the goat. And then the idea is that it's a racially miscegenated food. It's white bread, the food of the white man, and curry, the food of Durban's black population. And it's fantastic and it's delicious. And the problem is that it's white bread that's soaking up goat curry, and it goes. So you have to eat it very, very quickly. And so you take the side of the bread and you twist and you dip it and you eat. You twist, you dip, you eat. You twist, you dip, you eat. And I mean, if you don't eat it in 3 minutes flat, you end up with a handful of mush. And the reason that, I mean, this is a very inconvenient food, right? There's nothing convenient about a loaf of soggy bread with goat in it that disintegrates on your hand, but it is convenient. Why is it convenient? Because of the strictures of apartheid and of the sort of regulations of the working life, and also the fact that it is at the same time a moment of resistance. And so the rise of certain kinds of convenience, there's nothing inherently convenient about anything. You have to look at the structures of power around that convenience to be able to understand how it is that something that looks very, very dodgy can, in fact, turn out to be incredibly convenient in its racialized capitalist content. So that idea of convenience, I'm very grateful for your raising, because yes, you're absolutely right. Convenience is this sort of strange, sort of luminous thing, but it has been capitalized. And I think that the other thing that the people aren't thinking about quite, I've started to think about as something that's a strange capitalist object, is our attention. It's the sort of thing that's bidded through our phones and through our online engagements. It's not something, I mean, and there is a history of our attention being bought in one way or another ever since you had free newspapers. And adverts in newspapers is a way of bidding for our attention, but the way in which it has been commodified recently, I think, is desperately worrying. But thank you for that question. Yeah, we covered a couple of those, but the convenience one is just it's a good story.
Hi.
Hello.
So I want to ask you about the organizing that you referred to, and Joyti's question about, Joyti's assertion, which you seem to agree with, that we can't reform capitalism, we have to be about replacing it, and yet people are organizing around the world right now to deal with the conditions that capitalism has imposed on them and to actually try to make some changes in the system. So this is maybe a two-part question. If capitalism can't be reformed, what is there for us to organize around? Because most organizing is about changing the rules in a particular workplace, or changing the standards in an industry, or like establishing wage rates differently in ways that capitalists don't want them. So I'm just curious about what you think is the best organizing, what inspires you, what you think is effective, and why. And is there any kind of inherent difficulty in needing to organize people around things they care about, things that affect them, and the bigger goal of getting rid of capitalism and replacing it with something else. The immediate concerns of people who are organizing tend to be small. They tend to be, on the reform end. How is that okay in your mind, or is there something else that organizers should be trying to aim for?
I'm honored by your question. I'm honored that you're here just to have a luminary of just social change and times.
And she's my sister.
Thank you for being here. Thank you for the question. You always start with the politics of the context in which you find yourself. You can't wish yourself into a different place. Much as I would wish Austin different, it's not. Here we are, and much as I would wish the United States weren't the United States in the way that it is. It is. So you always. I think that's as you know. As sort of organizing 101 is you start where you are. You start with the politics and the concerns of constituencies with which are very sort of real constituencies where you find yourself. So then what do you do with that? The kinds of organizing that I've been most inspired by is the kind of organizing that respects the intellectual capacity of the people being organized. I think that there's a bit of a divide here where some parts of the union movement, for example, have a certain contempt for rank and file, and some kinds of organizing would prefer that you click here to change the world, but leave you largely unchanged by the experience. And for me, what's really interesting, what's really important about good organizing, where I see it in, for example, there's a group called the MST in Brazil, the Brazilian Landless Rural Workers Movement. Now, what I like about them is that, first of all, they start organizing folk in favelas, in shanty towns, and they work with them to say, hey, you know what, it's possible for you to actually occupy land and control it. And so they work for years to be able to, here are the skills we need to be able to occupy and control this land. And then they occupy and control the land, they start farming. And over 1 million people have been resettled this way in Brazil. This isn't some sort of idle speculation. 1 million people resettled on this land. And then what do? They're working on, we're farming differently, we're not doing monoculture, we're growing polyculture, we're growing lots of different things at the same time. And then these communities find themselves in trouble because we have all this wonderful agroecological food. We have this amazing milk that's organic up to the hilt, but who's going to buy it? So initially they sell to Nestle. So the MST had sold milk to Nestle. This is not what a revolutionary Marxist organization you would imagine does. But what are they going to do? Well, what they're going to do is say, well, this is not okay. Yes, we'll sell to Nestle because we need the money. But let's figure out an alternative. What's the alternative? We need to figure out how to create new markets. What's a good market? Kids. We need to sell our food to the local school district. And so they work to pass a law that says 30% of food eaten in Brazilian school has to come from local farmers. And then they say, if that food is grown agroecologically, then we get a 30% price premium. And then they work with the Human Rights Agency to say, you know what, part of the reason kids are not down with eating kale or whatever it is that we have on our farm is because they're being marketed to by these corporations. So let's see if we can ban all marketing of everything to children. Because why do we give our children to these multinationals? And so all of a sudden, these are revolutionary organizations that have a very strong commitment to a certain kind of vision of Leninism. But they're also like, look, we'll sell to Nestle if we have to. But we organize where we find ourselves with the momentum that we have, with the opportunities that are right in front of us. And I love that because all these ideas don't come from João Pedro, who's doesn't come from head office. It always comes from the militants who are at the grassroots. And that idea, and hopefully you'll see this in the film that we've been working on in Malawi, it's always grassroots intellectuals who come up with the best ideas. And there's never a name associated with it. It's not like, Comrade X came up with this. It's just like, yeah, we decided, we tried out a few experiments, a couple of them failed, and then we tried this and it worked. And that idea of being able to be powerful enough to be an experimenter in social change is a model of organizing that you don't often see in the United States. And when I see it, I love it, but I don't see it enough here. So it's a way of just honoring your work and also honoring the question in a way that says, look, we always, we have to start with where we are, but then we have to work with militants to, recognize that we can be more powerful than necessarily our organizers are sometimes let us believe.
Yeah. Can I just say one thing to follow up? Those are excellent examples. I also really admire the MST. I just want to point out that those wins that you described, banning advertising to kids, selling our milk to the school district, it's still capitalism. Selling our milk to the school district is still capitalism, and I've been thinking a lot too about alternatives and where are we going to go from here, and do we have enough time to get there? But I think a reality of organizing actual human beings and working in an actual context, making actual change, is that there are a lot of things you have to do within the system until you can change major parts of the system. So kind of binaries of like we're organizing for a revolution or we're organizing for reform are really false binaries to
Yes,
me.
that's right.
Because even revolutions have steps, for example, which can feel and look reformist in Marxist terms or like ideologically purist terms. So the practicalities of most organizing is that people become more radical by actually doing it, which means they're not starting at the most radical place at the beginning. And that victories build on top of each other. So the skill isn't figuring out what you're going to go after, because it might open up other space rather than close down space. So just like no gender binaries, maybe no strategic binaries for us either, if we want to make it different for actual people.
Well, I mean, I think that's right. I mean, purity is the enemy of actually getting things done. And I don't think intellectual, the sort of revolutionary purity of not working with unions or whatever it is wrong. But I also think, and this is and I also think that one of the things about the MSc that they've done really wisely is create schools. To have schools for agroecology that are also schools for political change, that are also schools for erasing these binaries. Again, this is all about the journey and not necessarily about starting off with holding the torch of revolutionary purity and then everyone must bow down and worship the light. But again, to celebrate that, the eradication and the move towards sort of non-reformist reforms.
Other questions?
I think I've had a point. It was very much around organizing, and it was the way that first of all, I grew up in a community that organized outside of capitalism, and they became a communist community in the United States, and ended up moving themselves back to capitalism because they couldn't actually do it when it came to like medication. There were some things that were very much needed that they couldn't do outside of capitalism. So it was very interesting. So I've lived that journey. And I've only very recently understood organizing, and what I've seen is all of the wins get hidden and subsumed. So I'll see a win and I know it came out of organizing, and then I'll see the way that it's positioned and all the other factors that take credit for it. And I've seen it be hidden over and over again in the United States. And so I guess my question for you just very simply is, do you dedicate time inside of your book to organizing and to talking about the wins and stuff like that? Because I'm not sure it's given the space it's needed inside of the work at large that's going on to highlight the wins that are happening.
Insofar as we talk about, again, this idea of the externality striking back, right?
Yeah.
We talk about the rise of the union movement in the battle around cheap energy, for example. To trace the union movement to the struggles that happened in the coal fields of the United States, in this country, or to think about the fights against patriarchy in, it goes back to beyond the sort of triangle showcase factory, but to see how it is that you have these important resistances. That's certainly part of what we try and do in each of the 7 chief things, is to talk about, you know, indigenous people fighting against cheap money and the exploitation of their lives in the quest for cheap silver. But what examples can you give us about where you've seen like victory being erased? Does anything come to mind?
Oh, even locally organizing around the immigration raids that happened, for example, and working with getting out the old sheriff and bringing in a different sheriff and working on the policies, just all of that work that was being done. And then I watched it get put into the media, and I watched it get handled by lawyers and by others, and who took credit for what. And I constantly see things I'm involved with, and then I read about them later, and the organizers are hidden and erased, and the people that are highlighted are usually lawyers and politicians. And so it leads to an idea that the way that the change was made was through the political process, but it wasn't. And so you get a false understanding of how that change was made by, and it's always like that, where power decides the narrative. Sorry, that's my drink water alarm. Protects us. But yeah, I don't know. And so I don't need to say more. I've only recently kind of understood this as I've been in the middle of movements and watched the work get erased and the answers get changed to what actually brought about the change.
I mean, I think there's so much mythology about how change happens, right? Like, oh, you write to your congressman, right? It goes up the channel and everything. I mean, if you look at all the major social changes that have happened in this country, civil rights, you know, how women got the right to vote, it was through massive struggle of the people. So, you know, even though like I'm talking about revolution and thinking about it, I think resistance is very important. I'm sure everybody would agree. But the main way, I think, even under this system, that with the wins that we've gotten, you know, I reflect on this a lot. I was born in 1970, and I realized, like, my entire life, I've like reaped the benefits of all the massive like social changes that happened that people fought for in the 60s. All those massive ruptures, right? You know, it's taken like 50 years for them, you know, Nixon and, you know, these like the old guard to reconsolidate and, you know, come back with a vengeance. But, you know, that is the way change happens. It's like from these struggles from below. And yeah, these mythologies drive me crazy. It's like, oh, this is how, you know, just, you know, I'm not being calling your congressperson, but that's not the main way that this change, these camps, concentration camps are going to be closed. It's not going to be from calling your congressperson.
I mean, I call Ted Cruz, he never calls me back.
Yeah. Well, I think if you have more questions for Raj and anybody here, you can mingle a little. Please buy some books, look around. I do want to say that right now there's at the Capitol, the Lights for Liberty vigils are happening. Do people know about this?
It's also in front of the detention center.
Oh, is it? Okay, are there two locations in Austin?
Yes.
So, you know, I'd say let's wrap this up and, you know, people can get down to those because it's, you know, we don't want to be on the wrong side of history on this one. So let's get out into the streets. But please join me in giving a big round of applause.